He was lying face down in the mud, holding his breath, waiting for the last sound he'd ever hear. A rifle barrel hovered near his chest, and he squeezed his eyes shut, ready for the shot. But the shot never came. Instead, a voice, calm, almost ordinary, said, "Hold still, you're gonna be okay." Hiroshi's eyes flew open. An American was kneeling beside him, not shouting, not spitting, not lifting a blade. The man was tearing open a small paper packet with his teeth like he'd done it 100 times. Gauze. Clean gauze. He pressed it into Hiroshi's side with firm, practiced pressure, and for a second Hiroshi couldn't even understand what he was seeing. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Hiroshi tried to twist away, more out of instinct than strength. His hands flinched toward the wound like he could hide it, like he could hide himself. "Easy," the American said again, softer now. "Easy." Boots crunched nearby. Another American stood over them with a rifle aimed down, watching Hiroshi like a cornered animal. That look, Hiroshi recognized it. Every army had that look. It meant, one wrong move and you're finished. Hiroshi forced his body to go still, not because he trusted them, because his strength had already been spent in the fighting, because pain and blood had turned his limbs heavy like someone had filled them with wet sand. The kneeling man, Hiroshi would later learn he was a medic, moved quickly. He cut through torn cloth. The scissors made a sharp little snip that sounded too clean for a battlefield. Then came the sting of antiseptic. It burned like lightning in the wound, so sharp it made Hiroshi's vision flash white for a heartbeat. The air smelled like wet earth, sweat, smoke, and something strange. Something clean, something that didn't belong in war. Hiroshi swallowed, but his mouth was dry. His tongue felt stuck to the roof of his mouth. Even breathing felt loud, like it might anger someone. The medic leaned in, eyes focused, jaw tight, not with rage, but concentration. His hands didn't shake. They didn't hesitate. He wrapped the bandage, tightened it, checked it with his thumb like he was testing a knot on a rope. "You understand me?" the medic asked. Hiroshi stared at him, silent. There were so many words jammed inside him, all of them useless. In his head, the only sentence that made sense was the one he'd been taught to believe since he was a boy. If you're captured, you're already dead. The medic reached into his pouch and pulled out a syringe. Hiroshi's whole body tensed. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. "It's for pain," the medic said, as if he could see the fear on Hiroshi's face. "Okay, for pain." The armed soldier behind them shifted his stance, impatient. "Doc, we gotta move. Captain wants prisoners to the rear." "Yeah," the medic replied, not looking back. Then his attention returned to Hiroshi like nothing else mattered. "This'll help." The needle went in, a hot pinch. Then warmth spreading through Hiroshi's side. The pain didn't disappear, not completely, but it loosened, like a tight fist slowly opening. The hard edges of sound softened. The battlefield didn't feel as close. Hiroshi blinked up at the medic's face. He was younger than Hiroshi expected. Dirt smeared across one cheek, sweat darkening his collar. His eyes looked tired, tired in a way Hiroshi understood. Eyes that had seen too much and were still doing the job anyway. The medic reached for a canteen. Hiroshi froze. Water wasn't just water to him in that moment. Water meant something. Water was what you gave a comrade. Water was mercy. The medic tipped the canteen to Hiroshi's lips. "Just a little," he said. Hiroshi's throat felt like it had been lined with dust. His lips parted before he could stop them. The first sip ran down his chin because his hands were shaking too hard to help. The water tasted like metal and canvas, like something stored and carried through heat and smoke. And yet it was still water, still life. Hiroshi swallowed again. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a burst of machine gun fire rattled and then stopped. A distant boom rolled through the trees. The war was still happening, even as this small, impossible moment unfolded on the ground beside him. In the stories Hiroshi had been fed, by officers, by posters, by whispered warnings in the barracks, the enemy did not kneel. The enemy did not offer water. The enemy did not say, "Okay," like a promise. In those stories, capture was a tunnel that led to one thing: humiliation, torture, a slow, ugly end. And Hiroshi had been taught something else too, something carved into him so deep it felt like bone. Better to die than to be taken. So why was this American acting like a bandage mattered more than revenge? The medic pressed down once more on the wound, checking the bleeding. He spoke low, more to Hiroshi than to anyone else. "We're gonna lift you. Don't fight it." Hiroshi didn't answer. His pride wanted to. His fear wanted to, but his body had nothing left. Hands slid under his shoulders and knees. A stretcher appeared, rough canvas stretched between metal poles. The medic kept one hand firm over the bandage as they lifted, steadying Hiroshi like he was fragile cargo. The ground dropped away beneath him. As Hiroshi rose, he caught one last glimpse of the spot where he'd been lying. The mud shaped by his body, the dark smear of blood, the shallow imprint of his fingers where he'd waited for the end. Only the end hadn't come. And that was the strangest part. Not the pain, not the fear, not even the shame. It was the confusion, thick and heavy, because if the enemy could show mercy, then what else had he been wrong about? The stretcher bounced as they carried him downhill. Hiroshi clenched his jaw to keep from crying out. The armed soldier walked alongside, rifle still ready, eyes scanning the tree line. The medic stayed close, adjusting the hold, checking Hiroshi's breathing, doing small practical things that didn't match the nightmares Hiroshi had rehearsed in his head. The medic leaned in again, voice steady, like he was talking someone through a storm. "Stay with me," he said. "You're gonna make it." Hiroshi stared up at the sky between palm fronds and drifting smoke. The light hurt his eyes. The morphine made the world sway. And for the first time since the fighting began, he felt a different kind of terror, because death had been simple, but living after mercy was going to be something else entirely. And if you want more true, human stories like this, where history isn't just dates but the moments that change people, subscribe to History Captured. You won't want to miss what comes next, and to understand why those few words hit him like a weapon. You have to go back to what he was taught long before this island ever touched his boots. A moment ago, Hiroshi had been lying in the mud, waiting for a bullet. Instead, an American medic had pressed gauze to his wound and told him he'd be okay. Back in training, the world had felt simpler. Hard, yes, but cleanly divided. There was the empire, there was duty, there was honor, and then there was everything else. Hiroshi remembered the yard where they drilled until their legs shook, dust rising around their boots, the sharp bark of an officer's voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. When the sun climbed higher, the heat sat on their shoulders like a heavy pack, but nobody complained. Complaining was weakness. Weakness spread. Weakness got men killed. They were taught to move as one body, to shout the same words, to bow at the same time, to swallow fear the way you swallowed bitter medicine, quickly, without letting your face change. And underneath all of it always was the same message. A soldier didn't belong to himself anymore. At night, when the barracks finally went quiet, Hiroshi would lie on his futon and listen to small sounds. The rustle of uniforms, a cough someone tried to hide, the low creak of wood. Sometimes, if the wind was right, he could hear a radio from a nearby building carrying a patriotic song, tinny and proud. The kind of music that made your chest lift, even when you were exhausted. It worked on him. He didn't like admitting that, even to himself. But it did. Before the army, Hiroshi had been the kind of young man who noticed gentle things. The smell of rice steaming in the kitchen. The soft scrape of a brush on paper when his little sister practiced writing. The way his mother folded letters carefully, as if neat folds could protect the words inside. Now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Here, the officers talked about death the way carpenters talked about wood, plain, practical, expected. They didn't say, "You will die." They said, "You must be ready. Ready to charge even if your legs wanted to run. Ready to hold your position even if the ground shook. Ready to use your last breath for something meaningful." And then there was the part they said most carefully with the hardest eyes. Never be captured. Hiroshi had heard it first as a warning, then as a command, and finally as a kind of fate. They told stories about prisoners. Not stories with details you could check. Not stories that sounded like a report. Stories that were designed to paint pictures in your mind, pictures you couldn't scrub off later. They said the enemy didn't treat men like men. They said surrender meant pain and mockery. They said the Americans smiled while they did it like cruelty was entertainment. Hiroshi didn't know if those stories were true. He didn't even know who had started them. But he knew what they did to a room full of young soldiers. They made fear useful, because fear could be aimed. Fear could keep you from hesitating at the wrong moment. Fear could make you fight when your body was begging to stop. Fear could push you forward like a hand between your shoulder blades. Some older soldiers talked in low voices after lights out, voices that sounded like cigarette smoke. "Don't let them take you," one of them muttered one night, staring at the ceiling. "If you're caught, you're dead anyway, just slower." Another man, barely older than Hiroshi, added, "And your family, they'll know. People will whisper." That part landed deep. Hiroshi could handle the idea of dying. Almost every man around him had accepted it as a price. But shame. Shame felt like something that would follow you home. Something that would seep into the walls of your house, into the way neighbors looked at your mother, into the way your father's shoulders might droop when he thought no one was watching. He imagined his mother opening a letter with trembling fingers, reading that her son had been captured, and then folding the paper again and again until it looked small enough to disappear. He imagined his little sister asking why her brother didn't come back properly. The army didn't have to threaten him. That picture did it for them. So he trained harder. He learned to hide pain. He learned to smile when he was corrected. He learned to bow, to answer sharply, to keep his eyes forward. He learned to push the human part of himself deeper down, like burying a warm coal under cold ash. Then came the leaving. The day Hiroshi boarded transport, the air smelled like salt and engine smoke. Men stood packed together with their kits, faces set in the same stiff expression, serious, loyal, ready. Some carried small charms sewn into cloth. Some had letters tucked into breast pockets like thin armor. Hiroshi had one letter too, his mother's handwriting. He didn't open it right away. He kept it pressed against his chest for days, like if he could feel the paper there, he could still feel home. And somewhere along that long journey, ship after ship, island after island, the stories about the enemy grew stronger. Every rumor became a warning. Every warning became a certainty. By the time he reached the front, capture wasn't just an outcome. It was a nightmare with a clear instruction attached. Don't let it happen. That belief was why, on the battlefield, Hiroshi kept fighting long after his body was begging him to stop. It was why he crawled forward when retreat would have been safer. It was why he told himself that dying in the dirt was cleaner than living under someone else's control. And that was why, when the fighting on the island turned chaotic, when the lines blurred, when orders stopped making sense, when the night swallowed the jungle whole, Hiroshi didn't just fear death. He feared what came before it. Because the moment the line broke, the choice he'd been trained to never face was suddenly right in front of him. And the night it happened, the sky didn't look like a sky at all. It looked like smoke, fire, and the end of everything he thought he knew. The medic's words, "You're gonna be okay," wouldn't make sense to Hiroshi until he remembered the night everything broke. The night the jungle swallowed orders and survival stopped looking like honor. It started with heat that wouldn't leave. Even after the sun went down, the air stayed thick, like the island was breathing through a wet cloth. Hiroshi's uniform clung to his back. His hands were damp on the wood of his rifle. Every insect sound felt too loud, like the jungle itself was whispering to the enemy. They'd been holding a position near a low ridge, nothing that looked important on a map but important enough to bleed for. Sandbags, shallow dugouts, a few scraps of camouflage netting that didn't fool anyone. The men around Hiroshi barely spoke, not because they were brave, because talking felt like tempting fate. Then the night cracked open. First, a distant thump, then another, artillery walking closer. The ground trembled under Hiroshi's belly as he pressed himself lower, cheek against dirt that smelled of rot and salt. Somewhere to his left, a machine gun started chattering in short, panicked bursts. Someone shouted an order. Someone else shouted a different one. And just like that, the clean lines of training vanished. Smoke drifted through the trees, turning the moon into a pale stain. Flares rose and fell, painting the jungle in sudden daylight, white trunks, sharp shadows, faces frozen in fear. In each flash, Hiroshi saw pieces of the world that didn't belong together. A fallen helmet, a boot without a man, a hand gripping a bayonet like it was the only thing keeping its owner alive. Hiroshi fired when he saw movement. He didn't even know what he was shooting at half the time, just shapes, shadows, the idea of an enemy. The recoil punched his shoulder. The rifle's metal burned his palm. After each shot, the silence rushed in for a split second, and then the island screamed again. A runner crawled into their position, breathing like he'd been underwater. "Hold," he gasped. "Hold the line," Hiroshi nodded like he understood, like the line was still a real thing. But the truth was the line had already started to fray. On the ridge, someone lobbed a grenade. It landed with a soft, ugly sound like a dropped stone. Hiroshi's stomach tightened. He tried to roll, but his body was too slow. The blast hit like a hammer. Dirt and hot fragments slapped his face. His ears rang so hard it felt like the world had turned into one long, high note. For a moment, he couldn't hear anything else. He blinked, eyes stinging, and the flare light showed him a man next to him, his mouth open, no sound coming out, eyes staring at nothing. Hiroshi didn't look long enough to understand why. He couldn't afford to. He tried to rise to a knee to find his unit, to find something familiar. But his side flared with pain, sudden and deep. He sucked in air and tasted copper. His fingers brushed his ribs and came away wet. He'd been hit, not cleanly. Not in a way that made him think, "This is it, I'm finished." In a worse way. The kind of wound that let you live long enough to panic. "Hiroshi!" Someone shouted his name, sharp and desperate, but it came from the wrong direction. He turned his head, searching through smoke and shadow. Another flare went up, and in the cold white light he saw two figures sprinting past, silhouettes that could have been anyone. Then the flare died and they were gone. He crawled. Not heroically, not like in the stories. He crawled like an animal with its belly dragging, teeth clenched, trying not to make noise. Each movement tugged at the wound. Each breath scraped his ribs. Somewhere ahead, an American machine gun hammered steadily, like a door being slammed over and over. Hiroshi pressed his face into the dirt and waited for the rhythm to change. When it paused, he moved again. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay where he'd been. The next explosion came closer. A tree cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. Leaves rained down. The jungle filled with a smell like burned rubber and wet wood. Hiroshi's mind narrowed to a few simple things. Keep moving, keep breathing, don't let them see you. And beneath that, beneath everything, was the lesson drilled into him until it felt like truth. Don't be captured. He reached a shallow depression behind a broken log and collapsed into it, chest heaving. The ringing in his ears had faded into a dull roar like the ocean trapped inside his skull. He tried to listen for Japanese voices, for anything that sounded like home. All he heard were Americans, not clear words, just shapes of sound, short commands, quick laughter that didn't sound happy, boots moving in groups. It was close enough that Hiroshi could feel it in his stomach. He pressed his forehead to the dirt. This was how it happened then, separated, injured, alone. His fingers dug into the soil until his nails hurt. He wanted his rifle to feel like a promise, but it suddenly felt heavy, useless. His arm trembled. The world swayed at the edges. In the darkness, his mother's letter flashed in his mind, not the words because he'd never opened it, but the idea of it. Her careful handwriting. The way she folded paper like she could protect him with neatness. His little sister's face, half hidden behind his mother's sleeve, trying to be brave. If he died here, at least the story would be simple. But if he lived as a prisoner, his throat tightened around a sound that almost became a sob. A flare popped again, closer this time. The jungle lit up and Hiroshi saw them. Americans moving through the trees in a line, low, careful, rifles up. Not monsters, not devils. Just men with dirty faces and tense shoulders, the kind of men who looked like they'd been awake too long. Hiroshi shrank deeper into the depression, holding his breath. One of them stopped. Hiroshi's heart slammed. His grip tightened on the rifle. For one wild second, he imagined raising it, firing, taking someone with him, making his ending proper. But his body didn't obey. His hands shook too badly. His vision blurred. The wound throbbed like a second heartbeat. And the thought came, quiet and terrible, I can't do it. He wasn't thinking about honor anymore. He was thinking about how cold the mud felt, about how badly he wanted water, about how he didn't want to die alone with insects crawling over him. The American stepped closer. Hiroshi could see the man's silhouette sharpen under the flare light, could see the rifle barrel, could see the cautious way he angled his body like he expected a trap. Hiroshi's chest rose just a little too much. The American snapped his rifle toward the depression. Hey, Hiroshi flinched, and pain tore through his side so hard his mouth opened on instinct. A sound escaped him, small, broken, human. The American froze for half a second, then shouted something behind him. More boots, more shapes moving in. Hiroshi heard the click of weapons, the quick shift into danger. This was it. Hiroshi let the rifle slip from his hands, not dramatically, not with dignity. It just fell because his fingers had no strength left to hold it. He raised his hands, palms open. The flare hissed overhead, and Hiroshi stared at those empty palms like they belonged to someone else. He expected the shot immediately, clean, fast. Instead, there was a pause, a long, impossible pause. And then through the smoke, he saw one of them, an American, move differently from the others. Not aiming, not hunting, kneeling. Hiroshi didn't understand what he was seeing until the man's hands came forward holding something pale in the flare light. Gauze. And as Hiroshi's world narrowed to that single, unreal detail, he felt his body finally give in, slumping back into the mud. Because whatever happened next, he'd already crossed the one line he'd been taught never to cross. The last thing he saw before the flare died was an American face leaning close, and a mouth forming calm words he didn't yet understand. When Hiroshi woke again, it wouldn't be in the jungle at all, but under canvas, with the sharp smell of antiseptic in the air. A few hours ago, Hiroshi had been in the mud, certain a rifle would end him. Now he drifted in and out of the world on a stretcher, carried by the same hands that should have been his last. The first thing he noticed wasn't a face. It was the light. Not moonlight, not flare light. A steady yellow glow that hung under canvas like a captured sun. It made everything look soft around the edges, as if the war had been pushed a few steps away. Then came the smell, sharp, clean, like alcohol and bitter medicine. It cut through the jungle stink still clinging to his clothes, smoke, sweat, damp earth, and for a second his mind rebelled. This smell doesn't belong here. The stretcher dipped, then leveled. Voices moved around him, quick and practiced, like men who'd repeated the same motions until they didn't need to think. Boots scuffed. Metal clinked. Somewhere close, a generator hummed in a tired, steady rhythm. Hiroshi tried to lift his head, but his neck felt like it was made of rope soaked in water. Easy, someone said, that voice again. The same calm tone from the hillside. Hiroshi blinked through the haze and saw the medic, the young American with dirt on his cheek, leaning over him with an expression that wasn't kind exactly, but focused. Like a carpenter studying a crack in wood. Like a man trying to keep something from breaking. A tag had been pinned near Hiroshi's collar. Hiroshi couldn't read it. He didn't know what it said, but he understood what it meant. I've been counted. He swallowed and pain pulsed in his side, duller now, like it had been wrapped in cotton. The medicine was still inside him, warm and heavy, softening the worst edges, but the fear stayed sharp. Because fear didn't need a wound. Fear lived in the stories. He remembered the warnings. The whispered certainty that prisoners were toyed with. That enemy hands were cruel hands. That surrender wasn't just defeat, it was disgrace. So why did this place smell like cleanliness instead of bloodlust? Hiroshi's eyes moved across the tent in small, careful steps. A long table, stacks of bandages. A tin basin with water that had turned pink. A row of men on stretchers, some groaning, some staring at the ceiling with the empty look of people who'd left part of themselves behind. And they weren't all Japanese. Hiroshi saw an American with his arm wrapped tight, teeth clenched as someone tightened a tourniquet. He saw another American sitting up, face gray, whispering a name like prayer. A man with freckles held a cigarette between trembling fingers, not even lighting it, just holding it like it could keep him steady. The sight hit Hiroshi strangely. He'd been taught to picture Americans as one shape, one idea, one enemy. But here under canvas they looked breakable, human. Hiroshi's breath caught and the medic leaned closer, checking the bandage at Hiroshi's side. He pressed with 2 fingers. Hiroshi hissed. "Sorry," the medic murmured, and it was the first time Hiroshi had ever heard an enemy apologize to him. The medic's name patch was smeared with mud, but Hiroshi could make out the letters when the medic shifted under the light. Miller. Hiroshi didn't know the sound of it. He didn't know anything about the man. But he held onto that name anyway, because names made monsters less useful. Miller reached for a bottle and poured a little liquid onto gauze. The smell bit the air again. He cleaned around the wound, quick and careful, as if time mattered. Hiroshi flinched. Miller's hand paused mid-motion. "I know," he said quietly, like he was talking to someone younger. "I know it hurts." Hiroshi stared at him, confused by the simple fact of being spoken to like this. Not shouted at, not cursed, just spoken to. A second American stepped into view carrying supplies. He had a different kind of energy, less still, more alert, like his nerves were wired tighter. He glanced at Hiroshi, then at Miller. "You sure about this?" the man asked. Miller didn't look up. "He's bleeding, I'm sure." The other man's eyes flicked away, scanning the tent, then the flap, then the world beyond it. He looked like he expected the jungle to reach in and grab someone. When his gaze returned to Hiroshi, it wasn't hatred. It was caution. Like Hiroshi was a loaded weapon that had been set down but not disarmed in the mind. That was fair. Hiroshi understood caution. The cautious man set a canteen near Hiroshi's head, not touching him, just placing it where it could be used. Then he stepped back. Miller adjusted the bandage again. "We're gonna move you to the back after this," he said. "You're gonna be okay." Hiroshi didn't know why those words kept being offered, but they landed in him like stones dropped into deep water, quiet ripples that didn't stop. A sudden shout came from outside the tent. Someone called for plasma. Someone cursed. A stretcher slid past the entrance, the canvas flap lifting to show a slice of night sky, black and smoky, distant flashes of light like storms far out at sea. Then the flap fell again and the little world under canvas returned. Miller wiped his hands, then picked up a small instrument, metal glinting. Hiroshi's eyes widened. Miller noticed immediately. "No," he said, firm but gentle. "Not for you like that. We're not doing that." Hiroshi didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the way Miller's shoulders settled, as if he was trying to lower the temperature of the room. Hiroshi's mouth finally opened and something came out, Japanese, broken by exhaustion. "Korasu," he whispered, "kill me." The syllables felt like ash on his tongue. Miller blinked, not understanding, but he heard enough in the sound to recognize desperation. He leaned closer anyway, as if closeness itself could be an answer. "It's all right," he said, slower. You're safe, safe." Hiroshi almost laughed at the word, not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. There was no safe in war, only delays. But then Miller did something that made Hiroshi's throat tighten. He covered Hiroshi's chest with a blanket, a real blanket, rough and scratchy, smelling like sweat and soap in storage. It wasn't soft, but it was warm. It was the kind of ordinary thing that belonged in homes, not battlefields. Hiroshi stared down at it like it was a trick. Why cover him? Why preserve him? Why treat his shivering like it mattered? The cautious American returned, crouching near Miller. "Captain wants to know if he's talkative." Miller exhaled through his nose, a tired breath. "He's hurt, that's what he is." The cautious man looked at Hiroshi again, then nodded once like he'd accept that for now. "We've got an interpreter coming later. Maybe." Interpreter. The word meant nothing to Hiroshi, but the way it was said, like a normal procedure, made his stomach twist. If they were planning questions, then the nightmare could still be waiting. Maybe this was just the beginning. Maybe the kindness was bait. Hiroshi lay still, eyes tracking the edges of the tent, listening for cruelty hiding inside calm voices. But minutes passed. No one struck him. No one spat at him. No one used him as a warning. Instead, Miller checked his pulse again, adjusted the bandage, wrote something on the tag, spoke to him like he was a problem to solve, not a person to punish. And that strangely hurt in a different way. Because if Miller was willing to treat him like a patient, then the stories Hiroshi had clung to, those stories that made dying feel noble, started to wobble. He thought about his officer's voice, the hard certainty of it, never be captured. He thought about what capture was supposed to mean. And then he looked at the blanket on his chest and the canteen within reach and the medic's hands stained with everyone's blood, not just his own. Hiroshi's eyes burned. He blinked hard, forcing the tears back, angry at himself for even feeling them. Miller noticed anyway. "Hey," he said softly, and for a second his voice sounded like it belonged to someone who had a younger brother somewhere. "You're all right, okay?" Hiroshi didn't answer. He couldn't. He just lay there, listening to the hum of the generator, the distant thunder of artillery, and the quiet, impossible rhythm of medical care happening in the middle of a war. And as the morphine pulled him toward sleep again, one thought stayed awake inside him, sharp and unsettling. If the enemy could kneel to save him, what would they do when they wanted something from him? Because sooner or later, someone was going to ask questions. The last thing Hiroshi expected after the field tent was dignity. But as his wound closed and his strength returned, the next fear wasn't pain, it was questions. They moved him before sunrise, not roughly, not like cargo. Two Americans lifted the stretcher with the same careful rhythm they'd used the day before, and a third walked beside them with a rifle, eyes scanning the darkness. The jungle felt different now, less like a battlefield and more like a doorway he'd already crossed through, with no way back. Hiroshi tried to memorize details the way frightened people do. The way the air cooled near a stream, the smell of wet leaves crushed under boots, the distant thud of artillery that reminded him the war hadn't paused just because his life had. When they reached a fenced holding area, he expected shouting. Instead, he heard ordinary voices, men calling to each other, someone laughing briefly, one sharp burst, then nothing. A kettle whistling somewhere, thin and strange in the middle of war. They set Hiroshi down and untied him just enough to check the bandage. A different medic looked at the wound, nodded, and wrote something on a clipboard. No ceremony, no cruelty, just procedure. Hiroshi sat up slowly, grimacing. Across from him, behind another section of wire, were other Japanese prisoners, some with torn uniforms, some with fresh bandages, some staring straight ahead like statues. A few kept their heads bowed so low Hiroshi couldn't see their faces. One man, older, looked at Hiroshi with eyes full of something bitter. Not anger at the Americans, anger at Hiroshi. Hiroshi knew that look too. It meant, you're here, you're alive, and that means you failed. The shame rose in him so fast he almost choked on it. An American stepped into view carrying a small tin cup. He held it out without getting too close. Water again, or maybe tea. Hiroshi didn't move. The American set the cup on the ground and backed away like he was feeding a frightened animal. Hiroshi hated how that made him feel small, watched, dependent. He hated that his pride still cared, even after everything. Hours passed in pieces. Men came and went. Names were called, prisoners were moved. The day warmed. The wire cast thin shadows on the ground like the bars of a cage. Then late in the afternoon, two Americans approached with a third man between them. This third man walked differently. He didn't carry a rifle. His uniform was neater. His face was calm in a way that didn't belong to a frontline soldier. And when he spoke, Hiroshi heard something that made his chest tighten. Japanese, not perfect, not native, but clear enough to be understood. "I can translate," the man said gently. "You're not in trouble for being wounded. You're going to be asked questions. If you don't understand, tell me." Hiroshi stared at him, suspicious. Another trick, another layer, Another way to pull something out of him. The translator crouched so he wasn't looming. "I'm not here to hurt you," he added. "I'm here so you don't misunderstand." A thin, cold thought slipped into Hiroshi's mind. Misunderstand what? The rules, the punishment. The moment they finally decide mercy is over, an officer arrived next, American, older, tired eyes, a folder under his arm. He didn't sit like a man enjoying power. He sat like a man doing paperwork he wished he didn't have to do. He nodded at the translator. "Start." The translator looked at Hiroshi. "Name." Hiroshi's throat tightened. He didn't answer immediately. In his head, an officer's voice thundered, "Never give them anything." But then he remembered Miller's hands, the blanket, the canteen, the words, "You're safe." He swallowed. "Hiroshi Tanaka," he said quietly. The officer wrote it down. "Unit?" the translator asked. Hiroshi hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the other prisoners. That older man was watching him again, jaw clenched, as if betrayal could be seen like sweat. Hiroshi chose his words carefully, not because he was brave, because he was confused. He gave a simple answer, a small answer, something any captured man might say without destroying himself. The questions continued. "Where were you stationed? How many men? What weapons?" Hiroshi's pulse hammered. Every question felt like stepping closer to a cliff, but the cliff never appeared. No slap. No sudden rage. No punishment for hesitation. When Hiroshi didn't answer, the officer didn't explode. He just moved to the next question or repeated it slower. Once the officer rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand and sighed like a man too tired to hate. Hiroshi couldn't understand it. This was pressure, yes. This was war, yes. But it wasn't the nightmare he'd been trained to expect. And the strangest thing was, Hiroshi could feel himself changing because of it. Cruelty would have confirmed the stories. Cruelty would have let him keep his world intact. We were right. They're monsters. I should have died, but restraint did something else. Restraint cracked the story open. At one point, the officer closed the folder and stood. "That's enough for today," he said to the translator. Then, almost as an afterthought, he looked at Hiroshi and spoke in English slow, like it mattered that Hiroshi understood the shape of it. "Medical will check you again. You cooperate, you'll be treated fair." The translator repeated it in Japanese. Hiroshi sat very still, treated fair. Those words shouldn't have mattered, not in war. Not between enemies who had tried to kill each other hours ago, but they did. Because if fairness existed here, behind wire, under watch, then what did that say about everything Hiroshi had believed? As the officer walked away, Hiroshi's eyes drifted to the tin cup still sitting near his feet. He picked it up with trembling hands and took a sip. Warm, bitter, tea. A simple thing, and somehow it felt heavier than a threat. Because now Hiroshi had a new problem, one he'd never trained for. If the enemy wasn't the monster in his stories, then who was he supposed to be next? And in the days ahead, that question would get louder, especially when they loaded him onto a ship with other prisoners, all carrying the same invisible wound, the shock of still being alive. A day ago, Hiroshi was certain surrender meant the end. Now he was being marched onto a ship still alive, still bandaged, still confused. The vessel smelled like salt, rust, and old diesel. Prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder in tired silence, their eyes fixed anywhere but on each other. Some looked hollow. Some looked angry. One young man kept whispering, "We should have died," like saying it enough times could undo what happened. Then an American medic moved through the group, checking wounds the way a man checks knots before a storm. He didn't skip the Japanese. He didn't spit. He simply pointed to Hiroshi's bandage and asked in broken Japanese, "Pain?" Hiroshi nodded once. A tablet dropped into his palm. A cup of water followed. Hiroshi waited for the trick, waited for laughter, for cruelty, for the moment mercy turned into a trap. Nothing happened. As the shoreline faded, Hiroshi watched American soldiers on deck too, one clutching a letter, another staring at the sea like it had already taken someone from him. And for the first time, a thought he'd never allowed slipped in. The war had stolen from everyone. But the ship was only a corridor. Ahead was the camp where kindness might end the moment questions began. The ship carried Hiroshi away from bullets, but not away from fear. Because behind wire and guard towers, he expected the old stories to finally come true. The camp hospital was quieter than he imagined. White sheets, disinfectant, a clock ticking loud enough to feel rude. Hiroshi lay staring at the ceiling, waiting for a hand to tighten into a fist. Instead, hands adjusted bandages. A nurse, American, hair tucked under a cap, checked his temperature without meeting his eyes, like she was trying not to embarrass him with kindness. Another medic brought soup that tasted like plain salt and warm water, and somehow that simple warmth made Hiroshi's throat ache. One afternoon, Corporal Miller appeared again. Same tired eyes, same steady hands. He didn't smile. He didn't lecture. He just looked at the healing wound and nodded like a man relieved a job had gone right. Hiroshi wanted to ask him why. Why save an enemy? But the words sat trapped behind pride and shame. Because the more normal this care felt, the more Hiroshi realized something frightening. They weren't keeping him alive to torture him. They were keeping him alive because they believed he was still human. And that idea was going to follow him into every conversation next. Weeks passed and the wound closed. But inside Hiroshi, another wound stayed open, the one nobody could bandage. Red Cross messages began to trickle in like drops from a leaky roof. Short notes, carefully chosen words, proof that his family was alive and proof that time was moving without him. He watched other prisoners react in private ways. Some cried quietly into their blankets. Some tore paper in half, then stared at the pieces like they'd ruined something sacred. One man refused mail entirely, as if love itself was a trap. Hiroshi finally opened his mother's letter, hands shaking as if he were defusing a bomb. Her handwriting was neat, gentle, and painfully ordinary. She spoke about small things: the house, the weather, his sister practicing her writing. No mention of honor, no mention of shame. Just a mother trying to keep her son close with words. Hiroshi pressed the letter to his chest and felt something heavy settle inside him. If he returned home alive, he'd have to live with the mercy that saved him, and the beliefs it shattered. And then, one morning, the camp woke up different, too quiet, too still, like the whole world was holding its breath. When the announcement came, it didn't sound like victory. It sounded like relief that didn't know where to go. The war was over. Some men cheered. Some stared at the ground. Hiroshi felt his knees go weak, not from joy but from the sudden question that replaced survival. Now what am I? Repatriation papers were processed. Medical checks. Lists. Instructions delivered in calm voices, like returning a human being was a routine task. Hiroshi watched American guards step aside to let prisoners pass, and the gesture hit him strangely, like being released from a cage he'd built in his own mind. On the journey back, the ocean looked the same as before, but Hiroshi wasn't. He wasn't returning as the fearless soldier from the posters. He wasn't returning as a martyr either. He was returning as a man who had expected execution and received bandages. And he knew the hardest battlefield might be waiting at home, in quiet rooms, in questions people asked with their eyes. Years later, he would finally understand what that mercy had really done to him. Even decades afterward, Hiroshi could still smell the antiseptic if he closed his eyes. He could still hear that calm voice in English, cutting through smoke and fear. Hold still, you're gonna be okay. He grew older, he worked. He tried to become ordinary again. But some nights when the radio played softly and the house was finally quiet, his mind returned to that ridge, mud on his face, hands raised, ready to die. And then the moment that never fit his old world, an enemy kneeling. Not to finish him, but to save him. Hiroshi realized something that surprised even him. Cruelty would have been easier. Cruelty would have let him keep hating. It would have kept the story clean. We were right, they were monsters. But mercy forced him to live with complexity. Mercy made him admit that people could be trained to hate and still choose in a single moment to do the humane thing anyway. He never forgot Corporal Miller's hands, steady, tired, stained with everyone's blood, not just one side's. And in his private way, Hiroshi carried that memory like a debt he could never repay. Not a debt of shame, a debt of perspective. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in war isn't a shot fired, it's the shot that never comes. And if stories like this, real human moments hidden inside history, stay with you, subscribe to History Captured. And if you know someone who still carries old memories in silence, share this with them.